Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we'll explore a surprising turning point in James and Tu Diep's story. After secretly running a DNA test, James finally discovers the truth about their relationship, and that single result changes everything, leading him to make a life-altering decision no one expected. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. The envelope sat quietly on the small wooden table between them. James stared at it for a few seconds before finally reaching out. His fingers hesitated slightly as he opened it, pulling out the paper inside. Across from him, the middle-aged doctor adjusted his glasses and waited calmly. "Mr. James," the man said gently, "before you read everything, let me explain the result first." James looked up. "You're Dr. Trung, right, Dr. Hung told me you would come." "Yes," Dr. Trung nodded. "Dr. Hung has been extremely busy, so he asked me to deliver the result personally." James slowly exhaled. "I appreciate you coming all the way here." Dr. Trung leaned forward slightly. "We completed the analysis using the 16-step STR method. It's a standard DNA comparison process used to determine biological relationships." James held the paper tighter. "And?" he asked quietly. Dr. Trung spoke clearly. "After completing the full 16 STR comparisons, we found no matching indicators of a biological relationship." For a moment, the room fell completely silent. James lowered his eyes back to the paper. "No biological relationship," he repeated softly. "That's correct," Dr. Trung said. "Based on the genetic markers we analyzed, you and Ms. Tu Diep are not related by blood." The words hung in the air. James didn't move for several seconds. Then he leaned back in his chair, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for weeks. "So it's true," he murmured, "Doctor." Trung continued carefully. "However, there is one thing you should understand. This test was arranged privately, without official hospital registration. Because of that, we cannot stamp the report with an official seal." James nodded slowly. "I understand." "But scientifically," the doctor added, tapping the paper gently, "the result itself is valid." James looked down again at the report. For days, he had been preparing himself for the worst possibility. The fear that everything between him and Tu Diep could be destroyed by a secret from the past had been weighing on him constantly. Now that fear was gone. A small smile finally appeared on his face. "Thank you, Doctor," James said sincerely. "You've helped me more than you know." "Doctor," Trung smiled politely. "I'm glad I could help." James stood up and shook his hand. "I won't keep you any longer." After the doctor left, James pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. A flight confirmation email was still open. His assistant had already arranged everything for him to leave the countryside that afternoon. For a moment, he thought about the busy life waiting for him in the city. Board meetings, contracts, investors. Then another thought appeared in his mind. Tu Diep, the quiet bamboo forest, the little wooden house, and Ni's cheerful laughter. James tapped his phone and dialed. "Hello, Mr. Duck," he said when the call connected. "Yes, sir," his assistant replied. "Cancel my flight." There was a brief pause. "Cancel the flight?" Duke asked carefully. "Sir, everything has already been arranged." "I know. Is something wrong?" James looked out the window toward the distant hills. "No," he said softly. "Everything is finally right." He hung up the phone and immediately dialed another number. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" "Diep," James said with a warm smile. "Ah, James!" Tu Diep sounded surprised. "What's wrong? I thought you were leaving today." "I was going to," he replied, "but I remembered something." "What?" "You once said we should go dig bamboo shoots together." Tu Diep laughed softly. "You still remember that?" "Of course." "Well," she said playfully, "are you sure you can handle it? Digging bamboo shoots in the forest isn't easy work for a big city CEO." James chuckled. Why don't we find out? A short time later, James arrived at the small wooden house hidden among the bamboo trees. Tu Diep was already outside, preparing tools. She looked up when she saw him. "You actually came," she said. James walked closer. "You sound surprised. I thought you were busy running a huge company." "Today, I'm just your assistant," he joked. She handed him a digging tool. "All right then, assistant, let's go." The bamboo forest was quiet and cool. Tall green stalks surrounded them as they searched the ground for fresh shoots. After a few minutes, Tu Diep suddenly crouched down. "Here, I found one." James hurried over. "That one?" "Yes," she said. "You dig around here first." James started digging enthusiastically. A few minutes later, he pulled out a large bamboo shoot. "Wow," he said proudly. "That's huge." Tu Diep laughed. "Beginner's luck." They continued searching. Soon their basket started filling with bamboo shoots. "Look," James said excitedly. "Another one." "That one might be too old," Tu Diep warned. He cut it anyway. A moment later, he tasted a small piece. Not bad." She shook her head. "Don't eat too much raw bamboo shoot. You might get dizzy." James laughed. "Understood." After nearly an hour of digging, they finally sat down to rest on a rock. James wiped the sweat from his forehead. "I didn't expect this to be so exhausting," he admitted. Tu Diep looked at him with amusement. "You're starting to regret coming with me?" "Maybe a little," he joked. They both laughed. Then Tu Diep suddenly looked at him more seriously. "James." "Yes?" She hesitated for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She looked toward the forest before speaking. "If one day you had to give up your position as CEO and come live here like this?" She gestured around them. "Could you really handle it?" James didn't answer immediately. He thought about the long days in corporate offices, the endless pressure, the constant competition. Then he looked at Tu Diep, and for some reason, the quiet forest suddenly felt more peaceful than any boardroom he had ever sat in. "It would be difficult," he said honestly. Tu Diep nodded. "I know. But," he continued softly, "if you were here with me..." She turned to look at him. "Then I think I could handle anything." Tu Diep blinked in surprise. "You're serious?" James smiled. "Completely." He leaned back against the bamboo behind him. "This life might be harder physically," he said, "but somehow it feels simpler." Tu Diep watched him quietly. "And besides," James added playfully, "someone has to help you dig all these bamboo shoots." She laughed again. "Then you'd better start building up your strength." "Deal." They sat there for a moment longer, listening to the wind moving through the bamboo forest. Neither of them realized it yet, but at that moment something between them had already begun to change. Not just friendship, something deeper. Later that evening, when they returned to the house, a small voice called out from the yard. "Aunt Diep! Uncle James!" Little Ly ran toward them excitedly. "You're back!" James lifted the heavy basket from his shoulder and smiled. "Look what we brought home." Ly peeked inside. "Wow, so many bamboo shoots!" Tu Diep laughed. "Your Uncle James worked very hard today." Ly looked up at him with admiration. "Really?" James nodded dramatically. "I almost fainted digging these." Ly giggled. "Uncle James is weak." James pretended to be offended. "Hey, that was my first day." Tu Diep smiled warmly as she watched them. For the first time in a long while, the small house felt full of life. The small wooden house slowly filled with the smell of freshly cooked bamboo shoots. Inside the modest kitchen, Tu Diep stood near the stove, carefully stirring a pot while steam rose into the air. The bamboo shoots James had proudly dug from the forest were now being turned into dinner. From the next room, laughter echoed through the house. "Uncle James, that's wrong!" James sat cross-legged on the wooden floor with little Nace sitting in front of him. Several school notebooks were spread out between them. "What do you mean wrong?" James said, pretending to look serious. Ly pointed at the notebook. You said this word means apple, but you pronounced it funny. James leaned closer. Oh, really? Then how should I say it? Ly tried her best to repeat the word. Apple. James nodded thoughtfully. Not bad. Ly puffed out her cheeks proudly. I learned it from my teacher today. James tapped the page. All right, then let's try again. Apple. Apple, Ly repeated. Banana. Banana. Bus. Bus. James clapped his hands once. Perfect. Ly laughed happily. At that moment, Tu Diep walked into the room carrying a plate. Dinner is ready. The smell of bamboo shoots instantly filled the air. Ly jumped up. Food! James stood as well, stretching his arms. I didn't realize digging bamboo shoots would make me this hungry. Tu Diep placed the dishes on the small wooden table. Then you should eat more tonight. James looked at the meal in front of him. There was a bowl of bamboo shoot soup, a plate of stir-fried bamboo shoots, and a simple vegetable dish. Nothing fancy, but somehow it looked more appealing than the expensive meals he usually had in the city. They sat down together. Ly immediately picked up her chopsticks. Uncle James, you have to try this one. She placed a piece of bamboo shoot into his bowl. This one is sweet. James looked at it carefully. You're the expert now? Of course, Ly said proudly. James took a bite. A moment later, his eyes widened slightly. Wow, this is really good. Tu Diep smiled. That's because you helped dig them. James nodded. Then I should go dig bamboo shoots every day. Ly giggled. You said you almost fainted earlier. James laughed. Okay, maybe not every day. The three of them continued eating while chatting about simple things. Ly talked excitedly about school. Today my teacher told a story, she said. What story? James asked. The story about the boy and the wolf. James raised an eyebrow. The boy who cried wolf. Yes, Ly said happily. James leaned forward slightly. That's a very famous story. Ly nodded. The boy lied many times. Then when the wolf really came, nobody believed him. James smiled. And what did you learn from it? Ly thought for a moment. You shouldn't lie. James gently tapped the table. Exactly. Tu Diep listened quietly as they talked. Watching them together made something warm grow inside her chest. James didn't act like a distant guest. He treated Ly with patience, like family. After dinner, Ly brought out her schoolbook again. Uncle James, can we learn more English? James laughed. You're very motivated. I want to learn many words. James looked at Tu Diep. Is it okay if we continue the lesson? Tu Diep nodded. Of course. So the small living room turned into a tiny classroom. James drew pictures on a piece of paper. This is a house, Ly repeated carefully. House. This is a tree. Tree. And this, James said dramatically, drawing a stick figure, is Uncle James. Ly burst into laughter. That looks ugly. James pretended to be offended. Excuse me, I worked very hard on that drawing. Tu Diep couldn't help laughing as well. For nearly an hour, the house echoed with their voices. Eventually, Ly started rubbing her eyes. James noticed immediately. Looks like someone is getting sleepy. Ly yawned. I'm not sleepy. But another yawn betrayed her. Tu Diep stood up. All right, time for bed. Ly reluctantly closed her notebook. Okay. Before going to her room, she suddenly turned around and hugged James. Good night, Uncle James. James looked slightly surprised, then gently patted her head. Good night, Ly. After Ly disappeared into her room, the house became quiet again. The night air drifted through the open window. James leaned back against the wooden wall. That kid has a lot of energy. Tu Diep nodded. She always talks that much after school. James smiled faintly. I like it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The peaceful silence felt comfortable. Then Tu Diep said softly, You didn't have to stay here today. James turned his head. What do you mean? You were supposed to return to the city. James shrugged slightly. I changed my mind. Tu Diep studied his expression. Because of the test result? James didn't deny it. Yes. He looked toward the bamboo forest outside the window. For weeks, I kept thinking about the worst possibility. That you and I might be related, Tu Diep said quietly. James nodded. If that were true, everything would have been impossible. Tu Diep lowered her gaze. But now we know the truth. James looked back at her, and that truth changed everything. She hesitated. Does it? James smiled faintly. For me, it does. Another moment of silence passed. Then James slowly stood up. I think I'm going to rest. Tu Diep nodded. You should. You worked very hard today. James laughed. Harder than any business meeting. As he walked toward the guest room, Tu Diep suddenly spoke again. James, he turned around. Yes? She looked slightly uncertain. Do you regret staying here? James didn't even need to think. No. His answer was simple and immediate. Tu Diep blinked slightly. Not even a little? James shook his head. Not even a little. He glanced toward Ni's room, then back at Tu Diep. Actually, today might be the most peaceful day I've had in years. Tu Diep looked at him quietly. James smiled one last time. Good night, Diep. Good night, James. A few minutes later, the house lights went out. Inside the guest room, James lay down on the simple wooden bed. His body ached from the unfamiliar physical work. His arms felt heavy. His legs felt even heavier. Within minutes, he fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, sunlight streamed softly through the bamboo outside. Ly woke up early and quietly peeked into the guest room. James was still asleep. She ran back to Tu Diep. Aunt Diep! Tu Diep looked up from preparing breakfast. What is it? Uncle James is still sleeping. Tu Diep smiled. He worked very hard yesterday, Ly whispered dramatically. He's very weak. Tu Diep laughed softly. Yes, maybe a little. In the guest room, James turned over in his sleep, completely unaware that the two of them were talking about him. For the first time in a long time, the powerful CEO who controlled a massive company was sleeping peacefully in a quiet wooden house in the middle of a bamboo forest. And somehow, that simple life felt exactly where he was meant to be. In this story, James secretly arranges a DNA test to confirm whether he and Tu Diep share a blood relationship. When Dr. Trung delivers the results, the analysis of 16 STR markers shows no biological connection between them. Because the test was done unofficially, the document cannot receive an official stamp, but the truth is already clear. Relieved, James immediately cancels his planned flight and chooses to stay by Diep's side. Soon after, he joins her in the forest to dig bamboo shoots, slowly experiencing the hard but honest rhythm of rural life. While they work, Diep asks whether he would really abandon his CEO position to live like this with her. James answers sincerely that the work may be tiring, but as long as she is beside him, he can accept it. Back home, little Ly completes their family,